Okay, so today we're going to be talking about functions. Now, you may be familiar with the word function or the general concept of it from mathematics. And the good news is that functions in computer science are somewhat similar to the functions you would see in, say, your algebra class. So, by the strictly computer science definition, a function is just it's a section of code or a piece of code that you give a name and that you can call. And when we say you call it, we basically just mean that you execute that piece of code. So here you can see that we have this list here, list 1. It's just got elements 1 through 5. And we're going to use a pretty basic function. So you may be familiar with, say, a function f of x from math class, where you would have this function f, you give it an x, an input, it will do something to that x, and it will give you an output. So some functions are like that. This function here, plus 1, this is how we define the function right here. We use the def for define, then we put its name, plus 1, that's what we're calling this. And then we have these parentheses here. And the parentheses are basically if you have any inputs into the function. So here we're inputting a list into our function. And then we have this colon here. And the colon basically just says, okay, everything that is indented from here on out is part of this function. So if I were to call this function, these pieces of code would be executed here and here. So in this case, let's say this was a f of x. Our x would be the list. We're inputting the list. And whenever you give a concrete value, such as list 1, or a specific number, say the number 5, we call that concrete value an argument. And that's what you pass into the function. If you give a function an input, we see you pass the input in. So here we're going to pass in our list and see what happens. So say plus 1, list 1. And you may remember that lists are mutable. So I don't actually need to return anything because it's going to fundamentally mutate or change the list that I pass in. So now if I print list 1, you may notice that everything has been added by 1. So that's pretty neat. So again, no return statement per se, but we are passing in an argument. So you may also have noticed that when I called the function, I used the parentheses with it as I called it. That's pretty important to keep in mind. So here we have a function that sort of defies what we might assume from mathematics. Because in math, you give it an input, you get an output. In the last one, we kind of got an output of sorts, but here, we're not going to return anything, but we're also not going to pass anything in. And this is why computer science says that it's just a named piece of code, because you may not necessarily pass anything into that code. So here we have foo, that's what we're calling our function, just defining it as foo, and all foo does is print the words, this is a function. Nothing is being passed into foo. But you may notice that when I called foo, I still use the parentheses, because this is how Python is able to tell that you're talking about a function. It's the parentheses. That's very important. So we called foo, didn't pass anything, and we just called it. So here we're going to pass, we have a new function here, this hello. We're going to pass it a name, and it's going to say hello plus whatever that name is. So as you might have noticed from now, you're able to pass in basically anything into a function. Any object can be passed into a function. So a number, a string, a character, a list, anything can be passed in, even a user-defined object, which we'll get into later. So we're going to pass in hello, and we'll say Jim. I'm going to say hello to Jim. See? It says, uh-oh, argument is not defined. Oh, hold on. Make sure to comment that out. And then we get hello Jim. Should probably put a space there, but you get the idea. You pass in an argument, and the piece of code will run. Now you may notice that when we define the function, we give the argument a sort of specific name. Here it's literally name. So whenever you want to define or talk about whatever you pass in the function definition, you just use the same name as up here. Whenever we don't have a specific concrete value passed in, it's no longer an argument, we call it a parameter. So here, name, here and here, is a parameter. But when we called hello and we passed in the string Jim, Jim was an argument because it's a specific instance. It is a concrete example. When we talk about abstract, name, that's a parameter. But Jim or John or Sean, whatever, a specific concrete example, that is an argument. And the last type of function we're going to talk about today is a recursive function. Now, I'll have a whole video dedicated to recursive functions, but basically it's just a function that calls itself. And you may be thinking, well, that's a little strange, It is a little hard to wrap your head around at first. Why, is that able to work? And the reason it works is that recursive functions have what we call a base case. So here, we have this base case. When you reach the base case, you return a specific value. But before you reach that base case, the function is able to call itself. So this just is a factorial function, nothing crazy or anything. But it's important that you notice that its return statement has itself in there. The function is calling itself. And this is a very important concept. And my next video will be talking all about recursive functions, but for now, it's just important that you recognize what they are and know what their definition is. So we'll wait for this. Should get 120, I believe. Yes. So that was talking about functions. Remember, you define them with def, their name, parentheses, arguments, and the colon. You indent from there, and that piece of code that you type in under this sort of definition statement, that piece of code you can now call whenever you want. You can pass it arguments. You also don't necessarily have to if you have this kind of function here with no arguments as well. It's just a piece of code that repeats. Sometimes you pass things in, sometimes you don't. You can pass in anything as well, any object, number, string, list, whatever. So that was just the basic overview of functions, and next time we're going to be talking about